And some of this kind of seems like common sense. And a lot of psychology is fairly much, common sense. For instance, Edward Thorndike, his claim to fame is that he proposed the law of effect. All right, sounds really fancy, right? But this is essentially just causation. This is just cause and effect. He says that to be repeated, behaviors followed by unfavorable outcomes are likely to be reduced, but behaviors that's followed by favorable outcomes are likely to be increased. To simplify that, if good stuff happens to you after a behavior, you're going to do it again. And if bad stuff happens to you after a behavior, you're probably not going to do that behavior again. And that's like a big duh, of course. If I stick my hand down to pet the neighborhood cat and the cat scratches me, well, a logical person probably wouldn't pet that cat again. Now, knowing me, I would still try to pet the cat. I'd be like, why don't you love me? But logical people, intelligent people wouldn't do that over and over again. All right. So he took something obvious and was like, I'm going to put my name on that. Right. So that's the law of effect. And he used this, or he showed this through a puzzle box that he used on cats. Now, how this worked was he would put a cat in the box, and there was a way to get out of the box, right? And once they got out of the box, they could access milk or food or whatever treat that he had put out there. But, animals, you can't just tell them, oh, to get out of the box, you just hit this lever and it'll open the door. The cat had to learn that by themselves. So the cat's locked in this box, trying to get out, pushing against the bars, meowing really loud, making a ruckus. And then eventually it accidentally pushes against a bar that opens the door. Okay, and so the cat gets out, it's rewarded with freedom, and then it gets to the food that was put outside the box. So Thorndike takes the cat again, puts it in the box. Well, what does the cat do? Instead of, yowling and pushing around, confused because it doesn't know what to do, it already knows to push on the lever because it has learned the law of effect. When I push this lever, I get out and I get food. Okay, kind of like how cats can learn to open doors. Okay, once they figure it out, there's no stopping them. Another example of this, other than the puzzle box with the cats, is imagine if you arrived early to work one day, purely by accident. Like you forgot it was daylight savings time and you got there an hour early and you're just like, I'm going to sit in my car and watch Netflix until it's time for me to clock in. Your boss notices that you're here early and you get praise. All right, and that's reinforcing behavior. Something good happened to you due to your behavior of showing up early. And so in order to keep getting that reward, you keep showing up a little bit early to continue getting that praise. So since you have a positive consequence following the behavior, the action is more likely to be repeated. You're more likely to show up on time. Okay, that simple positive reinforcement, he just put a different spin on it. Okay, that's why in our video from Big Bang Theory, Sheldon said, oh, I'm building on the behaviorist approach of positive reinforcement studied by Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. Okay, they're paired together as behaviorists that came up with this theory because of their terms that they defined explaining that behavior. Does that make sense so far? Now, in order to get animals to do this behavior, so for instance, if I told you showing up early to work will be a good thing, it'll be a positive thing, it might get you a promotion, well, you might logically be able to figure that out because you're human. But with animals, they have to figure it out on accident. So he couldn't tell the cat in the puzzle box, oh, push this lever. He couldn't point to it and be like, hey, the lever over here. The cat had to come across it by accident. So with this law of effect, the difference between it and just regular positive reinforcement is the fact that it occurs by accident. All of a sudden, something good happens, and so they repeat whatever behavior they associated with that good effect. And with animals in particular, you can get them to learn how to build upon those behaviors. So pushing against a lever, that's not really impressive. I mean, you can train any cat to get out of the box. But what about training your cat to use the toilet like a human? Okay, you may not be able to, yeah, Jasmine's looking like, why would you even, all right, let me live my life, right? I actually know someone who did try to do this. I've never tried it with my cats. I've got them their own cat genie, so it's their own toilet. But with this, to train a cat to use the potty like a human, that's not something that's innately understandable by then. You can't explain it. So you have to slowly shape them. You have to take it step by step. So in order to get the cat to figure out what they're doing, you use successive approximations. You guide their behavior towards the behavior that you want. So if I were to teach my cat how to do this, I might give them a treat every time they go into the bathroom. Okay, every time they walk into my bathroom, I'm like, oh, good kitty, here's a treat. Okay, and then eventually I stop giving them the treat and I only give them the treat when they go up to the toilet. So they learn, oh, it's not enough to just get into the bathroom to cross the threshold. I have to get to the toilet. Then I might give them a treat every time they jump up on the toilet. All right. And then eventually train them. Like there's even a little kit that you can use to train them with litter and everything. Don't ask me how I know, but you could use that to shape their behavior. So eventually they figure out, oh, I'm supposed to pee in there. I don't know if you can train them to flush, but that would be the next step, right? Same thing with dogs, right? You may teach a dog to bring you the newspaper. Well, first you start rewarding them whenever they pick up anything and bring it to you. Then you reward them whenever they drop it. Okay, things like that. With education, how are you trained to write an essay? Well, when you first get into school in kindergarten, the first thing they do is they teach you the alphabet. They're not going to straight up say, okay, here's a history on the causes and effects of the American Revolution, go, right? Because the kid would just be like, I'm going to vomit on that paper, right? So that you start with the alphabet. Then you build up from the alphabet to words. Then you build up from the words to sentences and sentence structure and grammar. Then you build from sentences to paragraphs, from paragraphs to full-blown essays. Okay, so you're taking it step by step. And this is called scaffolding. I'm going to type that in the chat. Scaffolding in education is where we start you out on the easier steps and then you build upon that skill. So in history, it would be essay writing. In math, you start out with learning your numbers. Then you learn subtraction and addition. Then you move to multiplication. Then you move to division. And then at some point they throw letters in there for some reason, right? So you're building up on those skills. When you go from 6th to 7th grade, you don't just forget everything you learned in 6th grade, you take it with you to 7th grade and they build upon it to a higher level. Same thing with shaping in animals. Okay, you get them closer and closer towards the desired goal by first rewarding them for the little things they do, and then they learn to start doing the bigger things. Does that make sense? Now, one of the main continuities that we're going to see in psychology is that these different fields that emerge disagree with each other a lot, particularly when it comes to their focus of what is important in studying psychology. Behaviorists and cognitive psychologists disagree on that topic. Behaviorists believe that the only thing that should count as a science, the only thing that should count as a science in psychology is what is observable, quantifiable, what is measurable. Whereas cognitive psychologists say, no, you can't just look at the behavior, you also have to look at their thoughts, their cognition behind it. So behaviorists only look at external stimuli. They only look at the behaviors, okay, and they don't look at what's internally happening. Okay, like learning by thinking about something or learning from observation and watching somebody else do it, or insight learning where an idea just suddenly comes to you and you have a light bulb moment. Okay, cognitivists are a lot more focused on what a person knows internally rather than what they do. And that's kind of in the name. It's behaviorist is behavior, cognitive is cognition. Good so far? Does anyone need this slide? Okay. So what is cognition's effect on operant conditioning? What is it that the behaviorists are ignoring when they look at psychology? Well, Edward Tolman, I'm going to type that in the chat, Edward Tolman, he came up with the idea, or he discovered the idea of a cognitive map. A cognitive map is a mental representation of, say, your environment. Okay, and it's something that's developed without you having to purposely learn it, right? None of you study the blueprints for your house in order to figure out where your bedroom is or where your parents' bedroom is, or more importantly, where the fridge is, right? You just automatically, through living in the house, learn that, this is where the bathroom is, and this is the sink that doesn't run as well, or where the water tastes weird. Like, do y'all have a favorite water fountain at school? I did when I was in middle school and high school. Right, there's like the good water where it came out cold, and then there's the water that tastes a little bit weird. Okay, so this cognitive map is something that's developed in your brain to represent your environment, right? And this is sometimes used in memory palaces as a mnemonic device in order to assist with learning and memorizing facts. So for instance, if you're going to write an essay, all right, your intro paragraph may be here in the entry door. Okay, and so you know that the table next to the door represents the causes of the revolution. The keys on top of the table represent the effects of the revolution. And then as you move into your dining room, that's going to be your first body paragraph. And then you look at items within that room in order to help you remember, okay, I'm going to talk about taxation. I'm going to talk about representation. I'm going to talk about Paul Revere. All right. So you associate those objects with facts that you need to know so you can better remember them. Right. Kind of like a muscle memory almost. So how did Edward Tolman discover this? How was he able to experiment with this? Well, he didn't use humans, he used rats. And he called this type of learning where you don't try to get a reward or you don't focus on learning as latent learning, which is kind of like saying accidental learning, right? So this is learning that occurs, but there's no immediate behavior that proves that it occurred. Now, behaviorists wouldn't study this. Behaviorists are saying, no, the only thing you can study in psychology is what is quantifiable. For learning to have occurred, you have to see some sort of behavior that proves it. Okay. Whereas cognitive psychologists say, no, you can learn without actually focusing on the thing that you're trying to learn. Okay. So this is learning that occurs that's not apparent until it's tested, until there's an incentive to justify your learning. So the example that Tolman engaged in was putting rats in a maze. Okay, now typically when you put rats in a maze, you put cheese at the end to guide them through the maze to get to the end, right? Because they're being rewarded with food. But with these rats, he simply put them in the maze and let them wander around with no incentive. And so that's exactly what the rats did. They just, wandered around their environment, turning around and just looked like they were lost. Well, as soon as a treat was put in that maze, they apparently had learned the layout. They had made a cognitive map of their environment that allowed them to get to the end very quickly. So it shows that they were able to learn without any incentive. They just were exploring their environment and filed it away until it became useful, until they needed it. Then when there was a reward for that behavior, they were able to zip to the end. So this is kind of like if you ever play trivia games, or if you ever go and do trivia out in public where they have contests, right? You don't know what you're supposed to study because it's just randomly going to give you facts like what's the capital of Arizona, okay? But so you're not studying for that trivia game. It's just made up of what information do you happen to know. So that's latent learning. Once there is an incentive, that's when you're like, oh, okay, I know the capital is X, Y, or Z. I actually don't know the capital of Arizona. Is it Tulsa? Does that sound right? Something desert, probably. Little Rock? I think that's in Arizona. I was not in Scholars Bowl, so. Alrighty. Another aspect of operant conditioning is learned helplessness. So you can learn to not enact a behavior, not just in the terms of a punishment, but in terms of a loss of control over your own life. And this ties very closely with people in abusive relationships or abusive households. A lot of people question, well, why didn't he leave? Or why didn't she leave? Or why did they stay? Or, this sort of thing, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's because in animals and in humans, When an animal or human believes that they can't control their situation, when they don't believe there's an internal locus of control, that it's just fate or that there's no escaping what's going on, then they will learn to just take whatever's happening. Okay, so this explains why individuals can accept negative situations and not respond to them, even if they have an opportunity to escape. So examples of this include like with this picture of an elephant. Y'all know that circuses are canceled because, you know, with the abuse that elephants experience in that field. Well, with animals in particular, if they're subject to abuse and say they can't escape, like they're chained or they're tied up, eventually, if you untie them or open the gate, there's a phenomenon that occurs with learned helplessness where they won't try to escape. They won't leave the familiar environment. And it's because they don't believe that they have control over their situation. They've just come to accept the situation as it stands and that it will never get better. Okay, so just staying at that same level. Good so far? All right, now y'all know that when we get back in January, we are going to test on this material, and it's not just going to be multiple choice, it's also going to be free response. So I have an example of a free response question that we're going to work on today. So what I want from y'all is, remember, we've got to do the policy or the mnemonic device of TAD. Give the term, give the definition of the term, and then apply it to the scenario that's given to you. So let's look at the scenario. Many people are concerned about the effects of the use of physical punishment to modify the behavior of children, so corporal punishment. Basing your answer on what we've learned in this class, apply each of the following in an argument against the use of physical punishment. So I'm going to work with you on the first one, modeling. Okay, modeling is the enacting of behavior that you want to be copied. Okay, it's observational learning. So if I were to answer this in 1 to 2 sentences, I would say modeling is a form of observational learning in which observers mimic a displayed behavior. Then I would need to apply it. Okay, how would modeling apply to physical punishment? Well, y'all know from our discussion on corporal punishment that children who have grown up in a household that uses corporal punishment are more likely to use it themselves when they become adults. So a child subject to physical punishment is more likely to utilize it in adulthood against their own child or spouse. So in 2 sentences, I've done TAD. I've used the term modeling, I've given the definition of the term modeling, and I've applied it to the scenario of corporal punishment. Easy peasy, 1 to 2 sentences. For classical conditioning, okay, go ahead and in the chat write how you would define classical conditioning. So go ahead and do T and D, term and definition. Okay, so someone in direct message said, classical conditioning is when 2 stimuli are paired together, and it says to achieve a desired result. Okay, so that can be a little bit more vague. So you need to talk about what type of result, what type of behavior is that controlling? If they pair 2 stimuli together, what type of behavior? Classical conditioning is the relation between two stimuli that evokes an involuntary learned behavior. Okay, good. So we're talking about involuntary behavior. So classical conditioning, all right, pairs two stimuli until the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus that elicits an involuntary behavior. So this person in direct message said, physical punishment can make a child associate wrong behavior with violence and not want to do it. Therefore, without thinking, the child can avoid a certain behavior because of prior experiences. All right, well, that's close. Okay, but this type of classical conditioning falls with involuntary behavior. So it's not about punishment or reinforcement, right? So what involuntary behavior would violence elicit? What involuntary response might a child have to corporal punishment? Yeah, good. Fear. All right. Remember that in reading this situation, it says many people are concerned about the effects of the use of physical punishment. So you could say that classical conditioning is the relation between two stimuli that evokes an involuntary learned behavior. And then with your application of that, you could say that rather than having the child associate bad behavior with a punishment that induces them to decrease the bad behavior. Instead, they'll come to associate the parent with fear. So whenever they see the parent, right, they might associate that with negative emotions, and that could have a disruptive effect on their attachment bond with their parents or their emotional development as it relates to their parents. Okay, because remember, classical is involuntary behavior. So you can't say things like, oh, the child will behave. Okay, that's voluntary. You have to talk about what uncontrollable emotions might be associated with that. Classical conditioning is a way of learning that centers around association. A child prone to physical punishment may associate learning with abuse, which can turn to violent acts in their adulthood. Again, with the violent acts in their adulthood, that's a voluntary behavior, okay, not involuntary, like their heart beating or salivation or fear. Okay, so that again, like I said before, classical conditioning and operant conditioning on FRQs is difficult because people often confuse the two. So now let's move on to operant conditioning. How would you define that term? All right, operant conditioning is when a stimulus is presented and leads to a voluntary behavior or action. Okay, so operant conditioning deals with voluntary behavior. You either have a reward that increases the behavior or a punishment that decreases the behavior. Okay, and applying it to corporal punishment. Okay, is corporal punishment something that increases or decreases behavior? Good, it decreases it. Okay, but one of the problems with corporal punishment is that the child may learn that instead of just decreasing their bad behavior, they may decrease doing it obviously. They may decrease the number of times they get caught rather than the times that they actually do the bad behavior. Okay, so if you're doing TAD for operant conditioning, you could define it as when a child receives a consequence for bad behavior that decreases the behavior. However, one of the effects could be that instead of decreasing the undesired behavior, they simply decrease the number of times they get caught. And that gets us into positive reinforcement versus positive punishment, which again is another area of concern when people get those two confused. So when we say positive or negative in this context, what do we mean? Adding. Okay, if you're doing, yeah, good. Positive reinforcement is when a desirable stimulus is added to increase behavior. Reinforcement always increases behavior, whether it's positive or negative. Okay, so for positive reinforcement, one could give candy to a child, okay, rather than punishing them. Because remember, reinforcement is stronger, more effective than punishment. Okay, now someone in the chat said you could give candy to the child after the physical punishment is over, but that would send mixed messages, right? They wouldn't really know if they're being rewarded or punished. It wouldn't really cancel out the two. Okay, so if you were to give the definition of positive reinforcement, like Arlesia gave in the chat, it is when a desirable stimulus is added to the environment to increase a desired behavior. One example of that is instead of punishing with corporal punishment, instead, when they do something you want, reward them with candy. And it'd be good to put in there how reinforcement is stronger than punishment. Okay, it's more likely to lead to change over time. What about positive punishment? How would you define that? Positive punishment is when an undesired stimulus is added to decrease behavior. Okay, again, positive means adding. Punishment always decreases. Okay, so positive punishment is the adding of something undesirable, an aversive stimulus, in order to decrease that behavior. How does that relate to corporal punishment? Is corporal punishment positive punishment?
Yes.
It is, but is it the only kind of positive punishment?
No.
No. What's another way to positively punish a child that doesn't involve violence?
Making them do more chores or something like that.
Exactly right. So if you don't want to decrease their gray matter, if you don't want to increase their risk of drug abuse or depression or violence in their future, instead of hitting them, you could add timeouts. You could add chores. Okay, that's also positive punishment that doesn't involve hitting children. Okay, does that make sense so far? All right, now the last type of learning that we're going to cover in this unit is observational learning. Okay, so this is learning where you don't pair stimuli together, you just watch what happens whenever that behavior occurs. And Albert Bandura is going to be the key psychological figure involved with observational learning. Now, observational learning is not associative. Put that in the chat, not associative. Okay, operant and conditional, or sorry, operant and classical are associative. You associate stimuli together. You associate consequences with behavior. Observational learning is different. Okay, so Albert Bandura is going to research these social theories of watching other people in our society and learning from other people in our society. And one of the most well-known experiments that he uses to do this is the Bobo the Clown experiment. Okay, so remember, you can't just have experiments where you're causing harm to people. That would be unethical. So in order to study the effect that observational learning has on children, instead, he would have the children watch videos of adults interacting with a blow-up Bobo the doll, Bobo the Clown doll. Okay, so y'all know those punching dolls that when you hit them, they come back up because the bottom of the base is weighted. So they showed the children two different videos. They showed some children the video of an adult interacting with the clown very, very violently, screaming and yelling and hitting the doll. Then when they put the child in the room with that same doll, the child often mimicked what the adult had done. So they picked up hammers and other toys. They threw the Bobo the Clown doll. They picked up a toy gun and pretended to shoot the Bobo the Clown gun. All right. Whereas if the adult had interacted with the doll peacefully, or had simply moved it from one area to the other and didn't hit it, okay, then the children didn't show that same level of violence. So this experiment shows that children learn from their parents and from the other adults in their life. And that includes learning aggression. Okay, so frustrated children are aggressive towards the clown after seeing the adult be aggressive towards the clown. And so this led to the foundation of the social learning theory, that it's not associated with punishment or involuntary behavior. It's based on what you see in your environment. And so how does this relate to corporal punishment? Well, specifically, if a parent, or sorry, if a child grows up in an environment where the first response to frustration or conflict is violence, then the child is likely to emulate that in their later relationships. So if you grew up in a household where physical violence was used amongst the parents, hitting or slapping each other, okay, then you're more likely going to normalize that behavior and assume that, oh, that's what happens in relationships. If someone hits me, then that's just acceptable, which it's not. Okay, so you have a lot of abusive situations that emerge because of the social learning theory, because of observational behavior. So we learn through observing others. And another word for this is modeling, which is pretty self-intuitive. It's like, yeah, you see the model. It models the behavior for you. You mimic or you imitate a specific behavior. For instance, when y'all learn how to drive, you learn from your parents, not just from they put you behind the wheel and they tell you, put the thing in drive for D or R for reverse, but in watching what they do. So if your parents text and drive, then you're more likely to text and drive yourself. If your parents don't wear their seatbelt, then you're not likely to wear your seatbelt. Some of your first cuss words you may have learned from listening to your parents drive when they get cut off in traffic. Because y'all, I think that using your turn signal is illegal in Alabama because no one uses their turn signal. Like, I have no idea. Like, I'll be at a light waiting to turn and they don't have their signal, so I don't turn, but they keep turning left and I hate them. I'm just like, you gotta make me sit at this light. People are behind me honking, saying to go, but I know as soon as I go, there's gotta be that one person that goes straight and T-bones me. And I'm like, just use the signal for the love of all that is holy. Or they just zip right in front of you. I can't handle it. Or people who drive in the left lane on the interstate and they make people go to the right to pass them. It's like, left lane is fast lane. If you're not going 90 miles an hour, then you do not need to be in the left lane, because speed limit, that's not a law, that's a suggestion, right? That's what I learned growing up from modeling. Although one of the people who taught me how to drive, my godfather, he actually tricked me. He said that stop signs, they're red and octangular. He said that stop signs with a white outline are optional stop signs. You only need to stop at the stop signs that are completely red. And he let me run a stop sign because he said we were driving to church and he let me run a stop sign. He was just like, Jackie, we need to talk about how gullible you are. I'm like, what? You said, I trust you. Why do you get joy out of tricking me? I'm very stupid. It's not an accomplishment if you manage to trick me. Very low bar. So why is social learning theory and modeling important? Because it leads to more questions. All right, leads to more experiments. For instance, what is the impact of violence in television or violence in video games on children? Okay, so many of y'all, if you grew up watching superhero movies or WWE and you have siblings, y'all may have set up a wrestling ring and like hit each other. Like my brother and I used to go outside and get bamboo and make sticks and then wail on each other. I think violence is just like a common thing with siblings, right? So based on that, if we see violence in these movies, like if we watch the higher rated movies, or if you play, for instance, I remember when y'all are gonna think I'm really old. What is that game that everyone complains about being violent, where you kill prostitutes and steal cars? Grand Theft Auto. Y'all, when Grand Theft Auto first came out back in the day, Okay, there was outrage. There's like, oh no, like if whatever child plays this game, they're gonna grow up to, murder people and steal people's cars. It's gonna have this huge effect on how they develop. They're all gonna be sociopaths, right? Okay, so what do y'all think? Tell me in the chat. What do you think is the impact of violent video games, movies, and TV on children or people in general? Do you think it does play a role, or do you think that that role is overblown? I remember a story about there was a kid who went on a rampage shooting, and they focused on the fact that he was very heavy into video games, but when he was captured, he talked about how when he shot a postman, he was surprised because in the video games, when you shoot somebody, they just fall down and die. It's like one shot, they're down, there's no noise, there's no screaming. When he shot the postman, he was surprised because the guy kept yelling. And he was just like, that's not like what it's like in the games. This isn't, but yeah, exactly. It's a video game. It's not real life. Or some people may enact out violent fantasies in video games or virtual reality or on the internet. And then eventually that no longer becomes enough to stimulate that dopamine rush. And so they go to the next thing of using it in real life. Okay, some of y'all are saying, I think you can have a negative effect, but not as big of effect as people think. Yeah, you can counteract that. Like if you give a 5-year-old Grand Theft Auto, okay, maybe that kid's gonna grow up with some problems. Okay, you probably shouldn't expose them to that sort of thing at a young age. But that's why they have those labels on video games and movies saying, hey, PG-13, right? But you also have some things not related to violence that impacts development. For instance, with the Me Too movement, right? Prior to the Me Too movement, you constantly in comedy have rape jokes or spousal abuse jokes or, just jokes about women, misogyny. Now that's not as acceptable, and it's part of cancel culture. And so you see a different group of people coming through this generation that are more sensitive to misogyny. And they're not likely to think that those kind of jokes or those kinds of things are funny. Like when I was growing up, Family Guy was all the rage. And nowadays it's like, yeah, they probably wouldn't be able to get away with a lot of things that they've said or done. See, they do not play a role in the development of violent tendencies. If someone is encouraged to commit violence by some form of media, then that impulse is already there. Okay, so you can have a combination of things. So the impulse was already there, and then it just gets fed into. Okay, particularly when we look at internet, like terrorist cells. Okay, the WhatsApp, or the WhatsApp app, WhatsApp, it's encrypted, and so a lot of terrorist cells will use that app for their marketing. And they also go on 4chan or IMGUR or Reddit to try to recruit people. Okay, so it could also be used as a recruiting tool. If you're old enough to know the difference between what's right and wrong when watching TV and playing video games, then it shouldn't be a problem. But I do think parents should monitor what children are watching and playing. It plays a big role if it's the only thing a child is exposed to, and the age can affect how a child interprets the game. But we also have other forms of social learning, like with courting, right? You may watch romantic videos and think, oh, when a guy is mean to the girl, or when they pull on her ponytail or push her down on the playground, it means that they have a crush on her. Okay, so that can build into our social expectations and what we see modeled as acceptable versus unacceptable behavior. Okay, so media does play a role, but we can't blame media for everything, right? Okay, that's why they even put restrictions on video games and movies saying MA for mature or PG-13 or rated R, can't get in unless you're 17 or you're with an adult, those sorts of restrictions on it. Okay, good deal. Now we're going to move into insight learning. We're almost done, y'all. I think we can do this. I think we can get it done. For insight learning, Wolfgang Kohler, which Wolfgang is like such a cool name. Like, I'm gonna put that on my list for baby names, Wolfgang. He came up with the concept of insight learning, which isn't just learning through trial and error or law of effect or observation. It's innate. Like it's that idea of when you have that light bulb moment, like when you invent something or you figure out the solution to a problem. Like how many of you have been in the shower thinking, or you've been about to go to bed and the solution to an issue that you had just popped into your mind? It wasn't that someone told you what to do. It was that you figured it out on your own. You didn't have to observe anybody. You didn't have to have association. You didn't have to watch from consequence. You were just able, yeah, shower thoughts, immediate. Yeah, exactly. You were able to figure it out on your own. So Kohler figured this out, and there's a video of this posted in Schoology, where he would put a tube with peanuts in it, right? So you see here, there's a little tube, and there would be peanuts in the bottom. And the chimps inside of the pen would try to get to the peanuts. They want it, right? So first they would take sticks and they tried to get the peanut out of the tube, but nothing was working. Okay, eventually one of the chimps has an insight moment. All right, and you see that there's like gears moving in his head. He goes over to the water section, the water bowl, and he fills up his mouth with water. Then he takes that water and he spits it into the tube. Okay, now why is he doing that? Because if he keeps spitting water into the tube, what are the peanuts going to do? They're going to float to the opening where he can just reach in and pick them out and finally get the spit peanuts. It's like, okay, maybe not that great, but hey, he figured out a solution to that scenario. Okay, so this type of behavior showed that the chimps were demonstrating insight and planning. Okay, so another example is when they put food above the chimpanzees, outside of their reach, and they put them in a pen with boxes. So they may try jumping, they may try knocking the bananas down, but they still can't get to them. And then all of a sudden, they come up with the idea to just stack the boxes on top of one another so that they can increase their height like a ladder in order to reach the food that they wanted. Okay, so step one is failure. They try to get to the bananas and the first easy steps they try, and it doesn't work. They stop and they become angry and frustrated, not knowing what to do. Then they start looking around their environment to problem solve. Okay, that's step three, the problem solving. You look for potential tools. And then they use the things in their environment in order to reach that conclusion, in order to solve their problem. That's the light bulb moment that we're looking for. Does that make sense so far? Does anybody need this slide? Okay, so step one, failure. Step two, you take a minute to assess your surroundings. Step three, use the tools in your environment. And then step four, success. Are we good? All right, then y'all, we have finished with Unit 4. What I would recommend doing is review the unit in the notes and review with the videos I'm going to post for Unit 4 as soon as I get a chance to get those uploaded on YouTube. But I would work on your free response questions. With your free response questions, you're going to focus very heavily on definitions, but also don't forget the A in TAD. You need to be able to apply it to the situation that's given to you. So make sure you tie it back directly to that situation that's been presented. Okay, so examples from readings or examples from class, and make sure that you answer in complete sentences in order to get those points. So focus on your vocab. You'll also have vocabulary due in January on Unit 4 if you want to go ahead and get ahead of the game and turn that in. All of that's posted on Schoology for you.